I'm Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today we're taking a look at the Atonement with Dr. Veli-Matti Kärkkäinen. Dr. Karkkainen is Professor of Systematic Theology at Fuller Theological Seminary and the author of Christ and Reconciliation, a Constructive Christian Theology for the Pluralistic World, Volume 1. So that's what we're taking a look at today. So Dr. Kärkkäinen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dennis, for including me again in your wonderful interviews and conversations. I'm very happy and humbled.
All righty. Yes, this is our second time, so it's good to have you back. So if you could let the audience know just briefly where you're coming from in terms of your ecclesial tradition, your theological orientation.
Sure. As you can tell from my accent, I'm European, originally from Finland. And at the moment of this interview, I am with my wife in our residence in Finland, where we spend part of the year. I have been professor of systematic theology at Fuller Theological Seminary, as Dennis said, for the past 24 years. So it's quite a long time. And being a docent of ecumenics at the University of Helsinki, which you can see as a part of my title, means that I also have a part-time appointment in my alma mater. Alma mater means your like mothering university, where you did your highest degrees. And I have also taught theology and lived for many years in Thailand, in Bangkok. So in that sense, I believe I'm a little bit of a cosmopolitan theologian, because I have lived and worked on 3 continents. I was born, baptized and confirmed in the Lutheran Church of Finland. And I am a Lutheran minister of the Word and Sacraments. At the same time, I can say that in my youth, I got very much involved and intimately involved with the Pentecostal Church in Finland. It's an indigenous Pentecostal church, and I also worked as part of my career as their educator. And even now that I am, despite the fact that I am a Lutheran minister of the Word and Sacrament, and I do pastoral work almost on a weekly basis, I have a very close and intimate relationship with Pentecostal charismatic movement. And so sometimes people call me Luther Costal.
Okay. Good. So we're dealing with atonement. So if you could give us a brief overview and definition of atonement, and then how atonement relates to soteriology and reconciliation.
Right. Atonement is an old or Middle English word, at-one-ment, meaning 2 parties coming together. And it has become in the English-speaking word, and it's a good word, it has become in the English-speaking word an umbrella term denoting everything that we can call the work of Christ, from incarnation to healing, to exorcism, to suffering, to dying, the death at the cross, and resurrection. So it basically, atonement means, if you talk to the people on the street, what has Christ, Jesus Christ, the second person of Trinity, what has he accomplished to make our salvation possible? And then, as you mentioned, the technical term soteriology. Soteriology means the doctrine of salvation. So because of what Christ has done, we are able to be saved by the triune God. And you also mentioned the term reconciliation. In my book that you mentioned, the first of the 5 volumes of constructive Christian theology for the pluralistic world. And the first volume is called Christ and Reconciliation. I name atonement, or alongside the term atonement, I use the term reconciliation, because reconciliation in contemporary theological and missiological vocabulary means a more holistic, more comprehensive account of the salvific word of Christ. It not only encompasses individual salvation, like personal salvation, but also the salvation of the whole community, of the church, and even the cosmos.
Okay. And then it's interesting to me how people will talk about theories of the atonement, but they include a lot of metaphor that are more like models or paradigms, or illustrations. So could you help us sort that out? What's the difference between an actual theory and those others?
Right. When you come to study, for example, at Fuller or any theological seminary, when you come to the study of theology and what we call either systematic theology or doctrinal theology or constructive theology, one of the courses you are going to take is on atonement and salvation. And as Dennis said, Christian tradition talks about various kinds of theories of atonement, and we are going to talk about those in a moment. Theory is, the term theory is okay, but I like more the term metaphor or an analogy. Metaphor and analogy means, when you translate it in English, is that it is something that is similar to and different from. Let me take an example. When we call God the Father, it means that in many ways our talk about God needs to have some correlation with what we understand as father, like I'm a father and also a grandfather. On the other hand, because it's analogy, it means that my fatherhood, even at its best, does not define God. There's also this similarity, difference between my failing, fallible, finite human fatherhood and God's perfect. And so when we talk about atonement, for example, we talk about in a moment, say, recapitulation theory or moral example theory. The metaphor or the analogy means that we try to find some object lessons, some hooks, H-O-O-K, from the contemporary world, from our world experience, to understand the richness and diversity and the fullness of Christ's salvation.
Okay. I guess some actually could be a theory. I mean, like Abelard's moral exemplar theory.
Yeah.
He's not necessarily you don't need metaphor to show that Jesus was a good example, and to follow him, we also become good. So some are more technically like theories, wouldn't you say?
Right. And if we very briefly recap those theories of atonement or metaphors or analogies, one of the very first ones was put forth by Saint Irenaeus. And Saint Irenaeus is an interesting figure. He belongs to the so-called Western tradition, which became mainly, but not absolutely, but mainly Latin-speaking. But his parents were Greek-speaking, and he is nowadays, Saint Irenaeus, he is revered in the Eastern Orthodox, the Greek-speaking church. His theory of recapitulation means that one way, not the only way, one way of looking at what happened with the coming of Christ was that he became one of us. The Word became flesh. He not only became one of us and identified with us, which he did, as John 1:14 says, he also reviewed, restepped, rewalked all the stages and steps of fallen humanity. In his wonderful writings, Irenaeus even kind of speculates that perhaps the reason why Jesus died at the age of 30 or 31, 33, 34 was that he had completed the course of the whole human life. Now, at the moment, I'm 66 years old. 33 years old is not full human life. But at the moment, it was. Even 100 years from now, I mean, back in history, in the US or Europe, most people didn't live much beyond 40 or 45, 50. So Irenaeus' idea was that what Jesus did is that he purified, he cleansed, he sanctified the whole fallen course of steps of humanity. And then, so that was a major metaphor theory of atonement for the first 1,000 years. Gregory of Nyssa and other so-called Greek-speaking theologians, they also came up with a ransom theory. Ransom theory is almost like a sermonic, like homiletical, related to sermon device, in which Gregory and others were saying that one way, again, not the only way, but one way of thinking about Christ's work was that Christ achieved, or he became a champion because he fooled the Satan, the opponent of God. We don't have to go into details. There's a famous fish hook analogy. But the idea is that Christ was more clever, more powerful, and he was able to overcome the power of Satan, who never had ownership on us, but he claimed Satan. And so these two metaphors, they dominated the first 1,000 years of Christians thinking of atonement. And you can easily find biblical support. For example, Paul in Colossians and elsewhere, he talks about the champion who proclaims victory over resisting and opposing powers. And in the book, in the Gospel of John and elsewhere, everywhere in the New Testament, they talk about Incarnation. In the second millennium, and more in the Latin speaking, in the Western Christianity, and Western Christianity means Roman Catholicism, Anglicanism, Episcopalianism, and Protestantism. There were theories such as Peter Abelard, or let me first take Anselm of Canterbury, a great theologian in the beginning of the second millennium. He looked at the story of salvation, how salvation was achieved in the New Testament. And he came up with a wonderful contextualization of the story. Contextualization means that basically what we do all the time, we look at the story of the gospel, we look at every story from the perspective and the context of our own environment. And that was a time when society was very hierarchical. There were levels of hierarchy, like there was God, there was king, prince, bishop, and so forth. And the idea was that things are good when there's harmony, when no one below in the hierarchy is violating the rights of the upper level, or to put it another way, when the subordinate pays dues to the one who is above. Sin, the fall, like the Genesis 3, means that the human person, who is of course subordinate to God, has resisted and has violated the harmony. And therefore his satisfaction model is built on the idea that an innocent Christ was needed to pay the price, not so much for the condemnation, but for the getting the balance to the scales of justice and honor. There was a fellow theologian by the name Peter Abelard, who was a very interesting person. He had a famous love story and everything else. If you come to study theology, you would love those stories about Peter Abelard. He was a saint, but not a saintly person. He said, yeah, and said, you are right, but there's one thing that you are forgetting about the biblical story of atonement. For example, what the first Peter is saying is the idea that Christ gave us a wonderful example of suffering. Of course, the suffering is also atoning, like it's a satisfaction to the demands of justice and God. But Christ gave an example. Or John 13, Jesus said on the eve of the Holy Week, he was washing the feet of his disciples. He said, do as I have done. So kind of self-sacrificial, if it's a good word in English, self-humiliating work on behalf of others. And then later on, by the time of Reformation, when we talk about Reformation, we mean beginning from the 13th, 14th, and focusing on the 15th and 16th century, the time when the Roman Catholic and the Protestant/Anglican churches deviated from each other. There came so-called penal substitution theory. Penal substitution theory builds on earlier theories, not only on ancients' satisfaction, but also on Irenaeus'. Like I'm a Lutheran minister, so Martin Luther, the great reformer, he knew very well Irenaeus' theory. He knew very well Anselm's theory. And penal substitution theory came out of the context of the late medieval times and early Reformation's judgment, guilt, and penalty-driven culture. The idea was that if you do something wrong, you have to be penalized. If you are not meeting the standards, you're gonna be slapped on the hand. And therefore the penal substitution theory, of course, finds a lot of biblical support. You can find biblical support for all of these theories, and penal substitution looks at those biblical passages in Paul, in the book of Hebrews and elsewhere, which talk about the fact that sin is not only a bad thing, but it's a rebellion. It's an attack on God, who is totally perfect, just, sinless, and therefore you deserve judgment. And this penal substitution, for reasons that we don't have to go into now, has become a major interpretation of our own times evangelicalisms, and particularly conservative evangelicalism's understanding of atonement. It certainly has biblical support. It has some traditional support, but it's a fairly late invention. Dennis, excuse me I'm a teacher, so.
That's fine. And how about Christus Victor?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Christus Victor. Gustav Aulen, a Swedish theologian. I'm from Finland, as I said, and Sweden is our neighboring country. And Gustav Aulen, he wrote in the 1950s the first edition of the book by the title Christus Victor, which means Christ the Champion. And therein he, the Lutheran theologian and a church leader, he reminded the Western Latin-speaking Christianity, Catholics and Lutherans, that penal substitution, or neither penal substitution nor moral example nor satisfaction model is the original one. The original one is the Ireneuses and Gregory's and others, the idea that on the one hand, Jesus retrieved, healed, cleansed the whole human life with Incarnation, and he achieved victory over all opposing forces. So it was a constructive counter-attack on most Protestants who thought that penal substitution and satisfaction are the dominant historical figures. Aulen was not dismissing, let alone, he was not undermining, let alone dismissing these satisfaction and penal substitution theories, but he said those are later than what I called the first millennium, Irenaeus and Gregory's understanding.
Okay, so it includes both the ransom and the recapitulation theory.
Yes, yeah,
okay.
Yes, yeah.
And it's also known as the classical theory, right?
Yeah, he calls it. Yeah, because it's classical in the sense that for the first millennium of Christian history, these were the dominant, not the only ones. Because maybe I'll step in here and say, one of the first things that I tell to my students, and also if you read my book that there is mentioned, is to tell the students that the Bible does not have a unified, or let me put it positively, the New Testament, the Bible, particularly the New Testament, has a very diverse, pluriform, multifaceted account of what the triune God did for the sake of our salvation. There are a number of metaphors, like Christ as the champion, Christ as the sacrifice, Christ as the moral example, Christ as the satisfaction, you name it. And of course, the whole story of Incarnation. So to be biblical in your understanding of atonement is not to stick with one metaphor of salvation, atonement, for example, penal substitution or recapitulation. To be biblical is to, like us, pause for a while, breathe in and say, Lord, what is the whole variety and diversity of things you are talking about salvation? And let me give one example, which I often give to my students. If you open the Gospel of Mark, which of course is not first in the order of our New Testament, but which most probably is the oldest one, it talks about Christ and Christ's salvation more in terms of obedient servant. if you open the book of Matthew, which is currently the first one among the four Gospels, it speaks directly to Jewish intuitions. If you go to the Luke, who is assumed to be a doctor, he emphasizes very much the importance of Jesus' compassion, his reaching out to the marginalized. And then John, the Gospel of John and the whole Johannine literature is very much a kind of allegorical, little bit abstract, building strongly on Old Testament various kinds of images of lamb, sacrificial lamb, or living water. So the point is that none of these metaphors, none of these theories should be made a test of orthodoxy. A test of orthodoxy, which I don't recommend, is that one opens up to the whole variety of revelation of atonement we have in the New Testament. And I can tell you, like I said, I'm 66 years old, and I have taught theology for over 30 years on 3 continents. I am still intrigued and fascinated by the diversity, by the richness, and the depth and width of the Bible's teaching about what Christ did. I'm also a preacher, and whenever I have an occasion, because I preach in the liturgical church, meaning I do not choose the sermon text. The sermon text is given to me, which, by the way, is a very good exercise. Many a times in my decades-long pastorate, I have preached on texts that, believe me, I would never choose myself. And some of them are dry, and some of them are like, oh my goodness, how can you preach on this? But each time when I have a text to talk about atonement, the cross, resurrection, reconciliation, I go back to my study. I immerse myself into the biblical materials. I'm trained in theology, so I probably know the main interpretations of theologians, but I go back to the Bible. It's so rich.
All right. So then moving on to violence, especially the penal substitution theory and other comparable theories. Violence gets talked about a lot. That's been a big deal for the last couple decades. So you delineate 4 points critiquing the alleged violent atonement of Christ. So if you could please explain these.
Thank you, Dennis, for mentioning it. I also feared that you will raise it up. First of all, violence, for better or for worse, mostly for worse, is a part of every living religion's record. You cannot find a religion without connection with violence, and I have written on it widely. Second, many critics nowadays, for example, we have a whole tradition of non-violent atonement theories. And I know some of those people, and I appreciate their scholarship, but I also am critical of some of the one-sided, non-violent atonement accounts. Namely, the way I see what the Bible is teaching about atonement is that, on the one hand, the Bible is realistic. We live in a world, in a fallen world, where there is a lot of violence, war, injustice, and the Bible, similarly to the Holy Quran or to the Old Testament, or to say the Vedas of theistic Hinduism, it chronicles accounts of violence. But on the other hand, in the light of teaching of Jesus Christ, I also see that there is an end to violence with the coming of Christ. Namely, Christ himself, he was willing not only to suffer on our behalf, and he suffered a lot, but he took up onto himself as an innocent sacrifice. He took up into himself all the wrath of God, all the violence of sinful people, and on our behalf, he became a sacrifice who helps stymie and stifle the cycle of violence. And therefore, I've learned it from my predecessor at Fuller, Miroslav Wolf, who now teaches at Yale and who has written many books on the topic. For example, a book whose title talks about Christ embraced his opponents. I've learned from him that with the coming of Christ, when he opened and stretched his arms around the world that resisted him, there was the end to violence. And the book of Hebrews says in the 9th chapter, I believe, that this one sacrifice meets all, Christ's sacrifice meets all God's demands, and there is not going to be any more sacrifice. So we can say that while Christ's death, suffering, was violent, I mean, what else you can say on the basis of the gospel stories? It meant the end of violence. And now we can go back to what we can call the shalom. Shalom is a Hebrew term meaning peace, reconciliation, the state of things being as they were supposed to be. So that's a brief response to a very important and complex question. And Dennis, I may add that I totally sympathize with, for example, my feminist and other women theologians' questions when they say that in the name of the church and church's atonement narrative, namely an innocent sufferer, Christ, the church has justified the suffering of women or the suffering of slaves. Yes, it is deplorable, and the church has to repent of it. But I'm saying that's not what the gospel stories are endorsing. The gospel stories have been abused, misused for the sake of colonialism, subordination of women, subordination of people of color, and the church has to repent of that. But that's not what the gospel stories are telling us. The divine revelation is telling us that we all, sinful people as we are, we would deserve a judgment, in that sense, a violent destiny to our lives. But Christ became the one who took our destiny, our lot, our judgment. He became sin for our sake, 2 Corinthians 5:21. And therefore, there is an end to the cycle of violence.
Yeah, so there's it's violent. The atonement theory, the atonement is both violent and non-violent, depending on
exactly. Yes.
Whose perspective you're looking at.
Right.
Okay.
I'm looking at the ultimate end, which is that violence has been dealt with. And think about that. In the book of Revelation, the ruler, the king at the throne, is a slain lamb, a lamb who was slain. It's totally counterintuitive. Usually the one who is sitting at the throne, like the royal throne, is a despot or is a ruler or a tyrant. But we worship a lamb who was slain. It's quite powerful picture of the coming to an end of the cycle of violence.
All right, so given the nonviolent impulse of the thinkers you refer to, what are your thoughts on overcoming violence?
Yeah, that's basically what I said, is that there's no denying the fact that in Jewish and in Jewish Christian narrative of salvation, there is the element of violence because sinful people attacked the innocent suffering Messiah, but that because of the willingness of the Son of God as the second person of Trinity to assume the destiny and the lot of sinful humanity and become sin himself. Think about that. I'm going back to 2 Corinthians 5:21. How can you understand the idea that the only one who was innocent, the only one who never committed a sin, he not only assumed sin, he became sin. That's the most that a human language can say. And I'm sure Apostle Paul, a highly trained theologian, a highly trained rabbi, first before he became Christian, he must have sought, looking for a word to express this divine mystery. But by this becoming sin for us, sin means that you are subject to God's judgment. He overcame the cycle of violence. No more sacrifice, no more violence, no more cross. It's done. It's finished, as the Gospel of John says in the book of, it's in the chapter 19. It's finished is the Christian answer to the cycle of violence.
So, in terms of nonviolence or pacifism, I mean, should we teach that Christians are never to participate in lethal violence in any circumstance? Or
different. Thank you, Dennis. That's different. I am not pacifist myself. I have a military ranking because in my native land, where I'm right now, every citizen has to undergo a military service. So we don't have a paid army. We do have, but basically, so if a war broke out, I would be called as a military person. So I'm not pacifist, but I totally understand those who are. For example, my Anabaptist friends and colleagues and others. But that's a different thing. It's an ethical, moral thing, which, and now I'm using Lutheran vocabulary. It's in relation to human persons, because a Lutheran theology makes a difference between things that are related to God, like coram Deo, in front of God, which means my own salvation. I cannot do anything. But coram hominibus, in relation to other human beings, how I behave ethically, morally, if I'm kind, if I'm rude, if I steal, if I'm honest. Those decisions are left to me to a large extent. So what you are talking about now, Dennis, about like pacifism, it's a matter of conscience. And the fact that I am not pacifist, even though I pray for peace, is not a statement against those who are pacifists. I wish and I pray that everybody would be pacifist. But I also know that in the kind of world in which we live, innocent people will be slaughtered. And if I'm a grandfather, also not only a father, if I see an enemy to my nation to come and slaughter my kids, my grandkids, I have to weigh between difficult options. So I don't have a ready-made answer for the ethical dilemma of pacifism or non-pacifism at the moral level. I was talking about in relation to God, coram Deo.
Okay. And so...
Thank you for really helping me clarify what was the context and the framework of my talking.
Okay. So then you talk about the incarnation in relationship to the atonement. So what's crucial there for us to understand?
Yeah. One of the things that I have learned from Eastern Orthodox theology and spirituality, and as a footnote, I have to say that my native land, this a small country, in Northern Europe, Finland, with only 5 million people, we have two folk churches, not state churches, but folk churches. One is Lutheran Church, and I'm a minister of it. And the other one is Eastern Orthodox Church. Eastern Orthodox Church and tradition. So when I studied theology at the University of Helsinki, I not only studied Catholic and Lutheran theology, but also Eastern Orthodox theology, like the Greek-speaking churches. Their emphasis on salvation and in Christology is not so much on the cross. Yes, it is, but it's more on the whole coming to be with us of God, the Word made flesh. Incarnation is not only a preface, a preparatory stage to be killed for Christ, if I put it rudely. Incarnation, the 30 plus years of Christ, they also serve the purpose of telling us that God, our Creator, is willing and anxious to become one of us, or letting Godhead to be united with what God has created, the image of God. And therefore, for a long time in my pastoral and theological career, I have reminded my students and my parishioners about the fact that even if, and now we have to listen carefully, even if Christ did not die at the cross, and he did, but even if he didn't die, incarnation would be a powerful salvific event. And now let me mention to you that in Christian tradition, there are two reasons to the question of why God became human. Of course, it is the answer of contemporaries, Curdeo Homos, the satisfaction idea, namely God became human so that he could die as a satisfaction for the justified requirements of God. But the other one, going back to Irenaeus and others, is that Incarnation, most probably, this is a speculation, would have happened even if the fall, the human fall, were not to happen. Namely, God would have become one of us, even if it did not require the suffering and death of God, the Son. Jürgen Moltmann, whom the late great theologian who passed a couple of weeks ago, he said something very important. He said both of these theories, Anselm's and what I said, the other one, are correct. But let's put it this way. The fall, the sin, the condemnation, the judgment, was not a reason, but an occasion for the coming into humanity of God. God has this desire of, as our creator, and we have been created in the image of God, God has the desire to be united with this one species, Homo sapiens, who among all the species has been created into his image. So in that sense, we can say that incarnation is salvation. We do not take it literally because thank God that Christ, the incarnate, not only became one of us, but he also suffered, he died, he was raised to new life. But the fact that he became one of us, like Christmas, is already a great salvific celebration. It's not only a preface to Easter.
Not only a preface to Easter, okay.
It's not only preface to Easter. It is, but it's not only.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot more we could say about that. So how about you talk about a lot about the considering the suffering of God and Jesus as crucified Messiah. So if you could talk about that. And also there's a quote in there that you put that was interesting. He said, the highlighting of the critical role of the cross in Christian faith and theology in general has nothing whatsoever to do with the particular suffering of Jesus.
What I'm trying to say is two things. One, there is nothing to be admired, nothing to be desired in suffering itself. Human nature resists suffering. I think divine nature resists suffering. We are made as the image of God for flourishing life, for life eternal, for life that encounters no destructive forces. That's one thing. The other one is that because of the kind of world that the triune God created, namely a world in which, despite and totally unrelated to sin, the forces of decay and destruction rule. You have to remember that in our contemporary understanding, the age of the cosmos is about 13.6 or 7 billion as in Benjamin. And we, the human beings, came to the scene about 50 to 2,000 years ago. So we came, if you think of a 24-hour day, we came to the scene in the latter part of the last minute. There's no way it can make any sense to say that, for example, the reason for the death of the stars or huge animals before us is because our fall. And the Bible never says it so. So it means that death and decay is not only because of human sin. It is because of the kind of world God has created. Why God created a world in which the second law of entropy, the law of decay, namely that everything every birth is on the way to death. It's finite life. Only God is infinite. First Timothy says so. So it means that because God has created the kind of world in which we live, and added to it, God allowed, not determined, God allowed the coming of sin. And because of sin and fall, we are not only prone, we humans, not only prone to die physically, but also prone to die spiritually. There's a chance, the Bible tells us, that if you don't repent, if you don't believe in God, there's a chance that you may miss eternal life, you may end up in judgment. I'm speaking like to a Sunday school audience. But God, the one who created the world in the first place and who allowed or did not stop the coming of sin, he not only took responsibility for the things, but in his Son and in the triune life, he subjected himself to suffering and death. Jürgen Moltmann's 1972 English translation, The Crucified God, continues the line of argument which goes back to Luther in the 16th century and the writings of many Jewish scholars, Abraham Heschel and others, who looked into the prophets and they said, God is willing to suffer, even suffer the gravest suffering of the people. Like in the book of Isaiah, the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, there's an interesting saying, I think it's in chapter 63, which says, I'm paraphrasing, in their suffering, they are meaning his people, in their suffering, Yahweh, he suffered with them. Think about that. We're talking about omnipotent, omniscient, and all the omni words. God, who is the creator. And this same God subjects himself to death, to suffering, to humiliation, to painful sorrow, as in the father who has lost his son, like the prodigal son. So that's what I'm trying to say, that on the one hand, suffering is not good. On the other hand, when it's necessary, God has paid the price.
Okay, but what do you mean by the quote then that the critical role of the cross in Christian faith has nothing whatsoever to do with the particular suffering of Christ?
Yeah, it means that we cannot point to one point or one stage of Christ's suffering. The whole life of Christ, the Word made flesh, was suffering. Think about that. He was the only innocent, the only sinless. When, for example, at the age of 12, he was found by his parents to be conversing with the religious teachers in the temple, and the parents were concerned. He said, I'm with those who are with my Father. He must have, Christ, the incarnate, he must have felt very deeply the sinfulness, the cruelty, the unfairness of this world. So his sufferings were not only focused on the last 7 days or how many days of his life. His identification with sinful humanity was a holistic vicarious suffering. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not directly taught in the Bible, but I believe it can be inferred from the Bible and Christian tradition.
Okay. And then you talk more about Christ as sacrifice and representative. And so,
Yeah.
And then you get into the penal substitution theory more here, which is really crucial. I think I like the way you handle it, that you recognize the limits and where proponents of the penal substitution theory take it too far, but then you also recognize that people on the other side take it way too far and throwing the whole thing out.
Right. First of all, when I critique penal substitution theory, I am not dismissing it. I'm not rejecting it. I'm just concerned about the fact that in many quarters of evangelicalism, and I'm evangelical myself, in many quarters of evangelicalism, one type of penal substitution theory, like after Charles Hartz and other great theologians, it has been made a test of orthodoxy. I don't want to name the name, but not many years ago, there was one major Christian mission or evangelistic organization which basically kicked out those workers who were not willing to sign or subscribe to a particular type of penal substitution theory. That is so much against Christian tradition and biblical variety with good intentions. And I understand, I don't blame, I don't judge those brothers and sisters who did it, but I am very concerned. So what I'm trying to say is that because the Bible speaks of Christ's salvific work in many images, Pannenberg, the late Lutheran theologian, he used, from him I have learned this idea of Christ as both sacrifice and representative, is that on the one hand, yes, there's a lot of sacrificial temple and cult, C-U-L-T, driven terminology in the New Testament. Just look at the book of Hebrews, which gleans from Old Testament, like Leviticus and other portions. But that's only one strand of the New Testament. There's also much literature in which Christ, something similar to, but more robustly than Peter Abelard, speaks of Christ's suffering not so much as a sacrifice, but in terms of example of being the people, come and follow me. And we have to remember something that many theology students don't realize, is that even if you go back to Leviticus, the third book of Moses, and you look at the first 6 or 7 chapters, there are, depending on how you count, 5 or 6, say 5 different types of sacrifices presented, very detailed, instructions. At least 2 of them, I would say 2.5 of them, do not have anything to do with shedding of blood or killing an animal. They're called sacrifices. They can be sacrifices of the fruit or like harvest, or they can be sacrifices which Yeah, which do not include the shedding of blood and the killing. And that terminology is transferred into New Testament, like Romans 12. It's a sacrifice of your life or your worship. And that's something we have to remember when the New Testament speaks of sacrifice. It also has the Old Testament, like sacrificial cult, temple in mind. But in Christ, it has been also changed into sacrifice of praise. Think about that. Sacrifice of praise. It's not about killing. It's about more like lifting up God. So my point to my students and to my readers is that let's live with all of these various kinds of images and metaphors of atonement, drawing from the Bible. At the same time, let's be open to the fact that different kinds of churches, say Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, United Methodist, Pentecostals, they may have their own favorite ones, and do not pit them against each other, unless, like in some ultra-liberal circles, they want to take away all notions of blood, sacrifice, forgiveness. Those have to be criticized and perhaps even put aside. But when a Bible-believing Christian tradition is looking at the rich and diverse tradition of Christian atonement, let's be more open-minded about how everybody comes to the Bible text. And let's not do atonement a test of orthodoxy. None of the early creeds, like Nicaea, Constantinople, Chalcedon, none of them even mentions a word about how you have to understand atonement to be an Orthodox, a right-believing Christian.
Okay, well, how about the question of wrath? I mean, a lot of Christians today have no place in their theology for the judgment or wrath of God. And so, of course, penal substitution talks about turning away the wrath of God. Christ taking the wrath upon. So what would you do with that?
I would say two things. One, I understand and I sympathize with contemporary sensitivities. In our culture today, differently from, say, the culture of 3,000 years ago or 2,000, we have become much, much more intolerant towards gross violence and wrath, hatred. If you, for example, in your college studies, or later studies, if you read like Homer or others, Odyssey, it's horrible violence. It was part of the culture of the times. And so we should not totally stifle or dismiss our contemporary sensitivities towards becoming less violent, less hateful, and less, talking less about the wrath. On the other hand, is that we also have to take the biblical teaching, which is that God is totally holy, totally pure, totally innocent, cannot stand any sinful things, no unholiness, and that there's a difference between holy and unholy. And therefore, to dismiss altogether all talk about the wrath of God because of our sensibilities is to massage the Bible text in a way that is not helpful. We also have to, when we look at the Bible, we have to let the Bible text to challenge us and even take us into a place where we say, what do I do with the text? So I'm not dismissing, I'm not taking out of my vocabulary all talk about the wrath of God.
Yeah, I think it's something very important to understand that concept, because otherwise we don't understand the effects of our own sin. It's not
Right.
It's not so much
And
God just punishing us for no reason, but it's the natural effects, if you will, of human sin. It's what comes back to us. Okay, then. So the Trinity. And then you quote Moltmann a lot here. So Moltmann, yeah, he's got some very famous quotes that you bring out, which are very confusing to me. I struggle with a lot of those. So I'd like to hear more what you think about intra-Trinitarian works going on there, and especially Moltmann's words.
Yeah. First of all, apart from Moltmann, even though I have learned a lot from late Moltmann, for me, one of the major omissions or fallacies of typical Protestant Reformation understanding of atonement is that it's only looked through the lens of Christ. Christ suffers, Christ dies, and so forth. And certainly, the second person of the Trinity is playing the main violin. But the point is that, for example, when you look at the event of the cross, in which the Son, S-O-N, the Christ cries, Abba, Abba, why hast thou forsaken me? It's a cry of abandonment, not only from the point of view of the Son. It's also a cry of separation from the point of the Father. Think about, because the Bible speaks about kind of family analysis. If your son or your daughter cries to you, Daddy, Mommy, why have you forsaken me? Nothing is more painful. Nothing is more disturbing to you. Then we have the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, who, like Augustine said, is the vinculum amoris, the love, or vinculum pacis, the bond of peace between Father and Son. When the Son is cut off from the life of divinity, so to speak, why hast thou forsaken me? The Spirit is also wounded. And thank God that by the power of the Spirit, on the third day, the Father is raising up the Son. Just 1 Corinthians 1, is it 3 and 4? So Paul is already using a Trinitarian language to speak about the cross and the resurrection, that the Father, by the power of the Spirit, is raising up the Son from the dead. And that also puts in a perspective the unjustified criticism by non-violent atonement advocates. Not all non-violent atonement criticism is unjustified, but oftentimes the non-violent atonement advocates are saying that Jesus the Son is not only innocent, but like reluctantly he is put into a kind of the recipient of violence, and there is an angry father who crushes his son to appease his own anger. That's totally foreign to what the Bible is saying, because a loving father who is looking for the prodigal son. And then Jesus, the second person of Trinity, everywhere in the New Testament is depicted as the one who willingly submits his life to the will of the Father. Like if you just read the Gospel of John and many other passages, and the Spirit is there to enliven and give new life out of death. So that's why I want to bring the Trinitarian account to say that, like similar to say the act of creation, the Father is the main creator, but the Father creates through the agency of the Son in the power of the Spirit. So atonement, even though Christ is the main protagonist or the main actor, he is sent by his Father, he willingly assumes his destiny, and he is raised by the power of the Spirit by his Father on the third day. I want to put Trinitarian doctrine into use also around the event of the cross.
Okay, so to me, well, okay, I'll read Moltmann's quote first. So he says, that was in your book, it was a deep division in God himself insofar as God abandoned God and contradicted himself. So I have a problem with this because we have Christ's cry of dereliction, why have you forsaken me, which is a quote from Psalm 22, and we have a whole lot of Psalms of lamentation that express similar thought. It's like, God, you're so far away from me, I'm in pain, Israel's being destroyed, what's wrong? But in the end, the psalmist declares thanks and praise to God and, you know, their trust in God. So to me, we need to look to the theology of the Psalms of Lamentation rather than creating, like Moltmann does, this division of God against God. It's like, wait. That's, yes. To me, that's way too speculative.
Okay, I grant the fact that perhaps Moltmann is too expressive here. But you have to remember, Dennis, that the many Psalms you mentioned, not only Psalm 22, which is the why hast thou forsaken me, they are Psalms of lament, and they all have the same format, the same formula, which is that in the beginning there's a lament, thereafter there is a confession or the acknowledgement of trust, and then they go into deep lament of all kinds of things they have suffered, and at the end they say, but you, Lord, you, Yahweh, are my rock, my thing. So on the basis of this form, and here I don't have to teach you form criticism, but the Psalms of Lament, which are about 30, 35 altogether, they all follow the same, what the form critics say, the form of lament. It's not to soften the anguish, the sorrow, the suffering, but it is to say what the Old Testament so powerfully says, including, for example, Job, is that even though things have been very bad, to you, Lord, I share my problems. And that's what the faith in the Old Testament is, that God, you have a problem because you have dealt me wrongly, but I'm still talking to you. And if you are not hearing, then I'm done. With this rhetorical thing, and I am not softening the force of your question, But in this light, I see that Moltmann is saying something similar to what Jeremiah, perhaps the second Isaiah and others would have said, like, Lord, you have a problem. Explain to me. If this is too much to say, I let it go.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting one, because that's, I mean, for a lot of penal substitution people, that is so much core to the theory, is that this separation, that Christ's actual physical suffering on the cross are small compared to the suffering he goes through in terms of actually being separated from the Father in a, not a figurative or a metaphorical sense, but in a very foundational and fundamental.
Right, in a realistic sense.
Right. Okay, so resurrection. So what is your place, what is your understanding of resurrection in soteriology?
Yeah, here again, I go back to my Eastern Orthodox learning, whereas in much of Western theology, Western as in Western Christianity, Western Christendom, the cross is at the center. In Eastern Orthodox Christianity and in the Christianity of the first millennium, before the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West became separated, the focus of the Easter time was not only on the suffering of the last week or the death at the cross. It was on the fact that because of his suffering and death, and thanks to his suffering and death, new life has emerged. So the emphasis in early Christianity, the first millennium, was in the fact that Easter is more the celebration of Easter Sunday than Monday, Thursday, or Good Friday. Not to pit one against each other. And therefore, I think we have to learn from Eastern Orthodox tradition the importance of resurrection. And if you look at the first, say, 2, 3, 4 chapters, and even the book of Acts, at least chapter 2, 3, 4, and maybe 5, when the apostles, following the day of Pentecost and the emergence of the church, when they preached, and by the way, those few chapters are the only authentic samples of early Christianity's preaching. We have nowhere else kind of authentic citations or samples of early Christian preaching. While they mentioned, of course, the cross, and there was also some accusations against the Jews who succumbed into the pressure from Romans to help crucify Christ. The emphasis is on that this Christ crucified, he was raised to new life. He poured out the Spirit, and therefore you can expect, for example, healings and the restoration of Israel and the coming of the final restoration. This kind of preaching is not heard much in Protestant circles, and even less in evangelical ones. Evangelicals occupy, rightly, to the extent with sinfulness, fall, repentance, the cross, blood, sacrifice, and that's not the problem. But they don't preach resurrection and the Pentecostal pouring out of the Spirit in a way that the earliest apostles did.
All right then, and so finally, you tie in the Ascension, the rule of Christ, and the final consummation, eschatology. So how do you bring all those together?
Again, I have to go back to early Christianity, the fathers and Eastern Orthodox theology. If any topic is in almost omission of evangelicalism and much of Protestantism, that is Ascension. I don't remember when I have heard a good or even a bad sermon on the Ascension Day. And again, in early Christianity, beginning from the book of from Paul's letter to Colossians, to Ephesians, some aspects of the first part of the book of Hebrews, the Ascension, 40 days after Pentecost, was hailed as the crowning of the whole work of Christ. Just think of the first couple of verses of the book of Hebrews. Paraphrasing, having finished the work of atonement, he sat at the throne next to his Father. And that's where the book of Hebrews begins, and thereafter says, he is higher than angels, he is higher than everything else. That kind of proclamation, when did you hear last time a good sermon on Ascension? Because Ascension also is a prerequisite to Pentecost. These are very deeply rooted biblical things from the book of Acts and from the end of, say, like Luke's Gospel and elsewhere, and Colossians and the book of Hebrews. They are almost totally neglected by evangelicals.
Yep, we miss a lot of things. It's true.
Yeah. And that's what I try to do in my writings and my teaching at Fuller.
Okay, and then, but in terms of eschatological final consummation.
Yeah, because as you know, the coming of Christ was an eschatological event. The end times, according to the New Testament calendar, began about 2,000 years ago, based on Joel chapter 2 and other prophecies. So in the coming of Christ, we already see the dawning of the final end. And therefore, particularly resurrection and ascension, they signal, they herald the coming of the end. There might be a small interval, as there is for the past 2,000 years. But the idea is that now that Christ has been risen from the dead and he's been ascended and sitting at the right hand of the Father, there's nothing that hinders the final consummation of the kingdom. We don't know if it happens in 1,000,000 years or in 2 years, because it's not given to us to know it. But we are already living in anticipation of the final consummation. And if, like in my case, if it doesn't happen in my lifetime, which is very probable, I'm already looking forward into final consummation, because when I switch from here to eternity, the time sequence of past, present, and future does not apply anymore. Even though the final resurrection will not happen with the transition of me to eternity, so there's still the final resurrection. In eternity, there is no sequence of time. I'm already sensing and perhaps already having a prolepsis of the final consummation, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
I'm looking forward to it also.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, I'm Dennis Metzler. You've been listening to The Charge. We've been with Dr. Veli-Matti Kärkkäinen, and we're looking at the Atonement. So check out his book, Christ and Reconciliation, A Constructive Christian Theology for the Pluralistic World. It's actually, what, 4 volumes or 3 volumes?
5.
5 volumes, okay.
My Constructive Theology is altogether 5 volumes, and that's volume 1.
Okay, so check them all out. So, Dr. Kärkkäinen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dennis. It was a great joy and privilege.
All right, peace to everyone. I'd love to hear from you. Please email me at thecharge.info@gmail.com. Please check out our other videos. Don't forget to hit like and click subscribe.